missed all the fun, didn't I? We were having fun in there. We were doing musical statues. It's good fun. Just one actually additional notice that Caleb passed on. Ralph, I think I'm right in saying that tomorrow evening at your place, there's a kind of worship jam thing or whatever. Is that right? So anyone who's up for doing a little bit of worship, being involved in worship within the community, it's one thing that we really value is to be a bunch of people who come together and worship Jesus. If you want to just explore that a little bit or just kind of hang out with the worship guys, then you're welcome to go to Ralph's house tomorrow at 7:30. And Ralph lives, you could go and ask him, but he lives in Hawfields. So just off the Gloucester Road up in Hawfields. So go and grab Ralph and find out a bit more about that and just kind of maybe rock up at 7:30. And then there's a few guys going to be gathering and they'd love others to gather with them. So feel free to join them if you want to. We are, we're in a series at the moment where we're thinking a little bit about spiritual formation. And we are in the, today, Phil, can we just pull the slide up? Today, as you know, is 1st of December. So it's, I don't know if anyone got an Advent calendar this morning. So this is Alicia's Advent calendar. Our eldest has got an Advent calendar, but she's away. So I thought I could open the first door because if she's not there, then I should do it for her. Because there's no point giving her an Advent calendar on Monday, and it's like got 2 to open on Monday. So I opened it this morning. Julie said, you've got to ask permission. So Alicia gave us permission. So the first thing we got was a cream egg twisted. Anyone like cream egg twisted? Perfect, there you go. Which I thought was a bit of an odd one. It's just under the seat. Sorry, it was a very bad throw. It's a bit of an odd one for Christmas, isn't it? But I guess they're kind of pulling Christmas and Easter all together this year at Cadbury's. I don't know what your thoughts are when you open the first door on an Advent calendar. I think there's something that happens in life where, as a kid, you open it and you're like, oh man, 24 days seems like so long. Like you're excited, aren't you, as a kid when you open that first Advent calendar door, but you're also thinking, oh, can I actually survive a whole 24 days before Christmas? And it feels like forever. And when you get older, you're like, oh my gosh, does that mean that Christmas is basically 3 weeks away? Like I haven't even thought about anything to do with Christmas. There's this like weird change in the way that you think about time, I think, isn't it? From being a kid where time seems to drag forever. And it feels like Christmas is like so far away. To being a grown-up where you're like, man, it's absolutely just around the corner. What I wanted to do today was to think a bit about Advent and waiting. Next slide, Phil. And in some ways it takes us back to something that Tom was talking about a couple of weeks ago. What we found out a couple of weeks ago was that Ruben is like the luckiest guy alive because he gets dessert after every meal. So if you go around to their house, you get dessert after every meal. If you come to our house, it's like maybe once every week. But at the Hope household, they get dessert. And in the Hope household, the thing that they worry about is that they really want chocolate ice cream, but there's only strawberry ice cream. But Tom was talking about how one of the things about kind of our emotions is that our emotions are often caught up with the stuff that we really want and the stuff that we have and the gap in between. Like we've got a kind of sense of a longing. Tom was talking about, I really want chocolate ice cream, and all I've got is strawberry ice cream. And in a sense, that's kind of life for all of us, is that we live in the gap. We're always living in this gap between the things that we long for and the things that we have. And in a sense, Tom said, that's who we are. It's like we are who we are in the gap. And sometimes, like the gap is a place of anger, or frustration, or longing. Like there's all sorts of kind of big emotions that are associated with living in the gap. And I want to think very briefly about that today, if we kind of riff it into Advent. Next slide, Phil. Which I think is to think about Advent as this kind of moment, which is a gap between promise and fulfillment. Next slide. So if you think about what you've got, is you've got this kind of Old Testament vision. I just pulled up one slide here from a text from Malachi, so one of the Old Testament minor prophets. And he has this amazing vision, this kind of promise of God coming and bringing peace through this little child who's going to be born in a place called Bethlehem, this little town up in the north of Israel. And finally, in Matthew, you have this moment of fulfillment of that promise where this child is born in Bethlehem. Next slide, Phil. But the thing is that there's like a massive long gap between these two moments. There's about 700 years of waiting. There's like centuries of waiting between the time when Malachi writes this prophetic vision down and the time when Matthew comes to start writing his gospel down. And the question that I have is like, how do we live with 700 years of waiting? Like in a sense, I think we are who we are in the waiting. Like in a sense, waiting is kind of if you really want to know who you are, like think about how you wait. Like if you want to know who you really are, think about what happens when you get strawberry ice cream rather than chocolate ice cream. Like there's certain moments where I think we get a kind of sense of self-knowledge, like a sense of seeing who we are, and especially the kinds of emotions that are generated by that. And what I want to do is very quickly think about that through one Old Testament character. So next slide, Phil. There's going to be quite a lot of text up there. That's just if you're interested in going back to the story, so you'll kind of know where it's coming from. We're really looking through Genesis 12 through to 18. So just so you know, I'm not making all this stuff up. It's also there in the text. And it's a story of this extraordinary moment of promise. So you've got this guy called Abraham, and God appears to him and comes with this extraordinary promise, which is to say, okay, Abraham, what I want you to do is I want you to leave the place where you are. Like, leaving is always a hard thing, isn't it? Because it's kind of stepping into the unknown. Like, okay, I want you to leave the thing that you know. I want you to step into the unknown, because actually the unknown is the place where I'm going to do something extraordinary with you, which is I'm going to be a blessing to you, and I'm going to make you into this extraordinary nation that's going to be blessed and also is going to give out a blessing. And the thing that's going to happen to you is you're going to have so many descendants that it's almost like more descendants than the dust in the entire earth. Like, I think if you go around our house and you just kind of run your finger across like bits of the house, there's a lot of dust. Like, just imagine how much dust there is in the whole earth. Like, there's a lot of descendants potentially in our house, I think, with every grain of dust. But maximize that for the entire earth. And that's a heck of a lot of descendants. Next slide. Now, the thing that happens is Abraham says, like, there's one problem, which is that I don't have a child. So it's all very well for you to promise that you're going to have as many descendants as the dust in the entire earth. But there's a little problem, which is that I don't have any kids. My wife and I are unable to have kids. They've been married for a while. They're getting on in age. They've certainly been trying, but nothing has been happening as far as kids are being born for Abraham and Sarah. God says, oh, don't worry about that. Let me take you outside and let's look up into the sky together. You're going to have as many kids as there are stars in the sky. So you've got these extraordinary moments of promise. Like God says, you're going to have as many kids as the dust of the earth. You're going to have as many kids as the stars in the sky. And the question, I think, is what do you do in that moment where something is promised, but not necessarily made visible yet? Next slide, Phil. I think this is interesting. This is what the narrator writes. He writes that Abraham kind of believes this stuff. Like, he kind of buys this experience of looking up into the sky. So he thinks actually that's something that God could do. But, next slide. What I think is interesting is what happens next, because what I want to suggest is that in the story of Abraham, you see two things that I think are very common to our human experience of living in the gap between promise and fulfillment. So between this place where it feels like something has been given us as a promise, like there's a thing that God is calling us to, and that thing actually coming through to fulfillment. And because it's tough to live in that gap, it's tough to live in that space between hearing something and that thing not yet being realized, between hearing a promise that you're going to have as many descendants as the stars in the sky or the dust on the earth, and having a wife who's barren. It's always blamed on the wife, it might be Abraham, but I think in this case it probably was Sarah. Next slide. This is what they do first. Now, I think what's interesting is this comes 10 years after. So basically you've got Abraham and Sarah living for a decade with this promise hanging over them. A promise of stars in the sky, dust in the earth. They've been at it for 10 years, trying to see this promise fulfilled, and nothing is happening. Like, they've got this kind of monthly cycle of hope and despair that they've been doing for a decade. So for a whole decade, they've just been living a decade of hope and despair. Hope, despair, hope, despair, for over a decade. After a decade, they're like we're sick of this. Like, we can't do this anymore. Like, we can't possibly do this anymore. And so they decide that a potential solution is to kind of work with the fulfillment of the promise, like many descendants, but to use a kind of an alternative surrogate mother to achieve the promise, which is the servant of Sarah. So she says, why don't you just try with Hagar? Like, we've been going at this for like 10 years, nothing's been happening, and there's a bit more before the 10 years. We've been married a long time. Let's try and get hold of the promise in some other way. And I think this is an interesting thing, isn't it? Because I think this is this moment where, as a human being, like one of the things we probably find hardest about being human is those moments when we feel out of control. Like, I know Fairground rides are meant to be like exciting because you feel out of control, but for me they're terrifying because I'm like, I know an engineer's designed it, but I just feel like I'm so out of control here that this is like terrifying me and scaring me. I would kind of like this ride to stop now, or maybe I regret that I got on this ride. There's a sense here, I think, of here at Abraham and Sarah, they feel totally out of control. And so the thing that's natural to do in that moment is to kind of take back control, isn't it? Is to try and grab hold of control. And in the gap, I think that's one of the things that we often do in the gap, is that when we live in this gap, a gap of waiting, between what it is we feel like God has promised and yet to see the fulfillment of that promise, I guess one of the things we often do is we just try and take control. We think, okay, I could fix this. Like, I've got a kind of fix-it plan here. Like, this is the way that I could make this thing happen. I could speed it along a little bit. Like, it's taking a long time. It's been a decade. It's been over a decade since God promised, and nothing has happened. Let me step in and try and fix it somehow. That's, I think, one of the first things that we can do in the gap, is that it's just really hard, the gap, because the gap of waiting is always a place where we feel out of control. And I think we have various relationships to being out of control as human beings. Like, some of us kind of embrace that a little bit. I think some of us really resist that. Like, that's a really hard place to sit. And it's easy just to kind of reach out and to try and fix it through some other way. Next slide. But there's something else that happens in this gap a little bit later on. So if we wind forward about another decade, then there's another response to this gap. And I think this is interesting because, in a sense, this isn't about trying to take control. It's about, in some ways, just kind of losing hope. It's about one of those moments of despair. Because I guess that's the thing about being in a gap, a waiting gap, is that one thing we can try and do is kind of speed things up. Like, I've got a few plans where I can speed this thing up. Another is we just say, like, whatever. Maybe I didn't hear right. Maybe the thing that I heard is stupid. Like, maybe I'm just being ridiculous to even believe and hope that. Next slide, Phil. There's this really interesting moment where this is like a couple of decades into this story, where God says, I'm going to rename Sarai to Sarah. She's going to be this mother of many. Like, she's going to be, like, I can see it happening. And what Abraham does is interesting here. This is the New Living Translation rendering of it. And it's interesting, if you look at this text, it's a text that's kind of translated in very different ways, because it's interpreted by theologians in quite different ways. What happens is Abraham falls down on his face, which is, in Old Testament speak, a kind of prime act of worship and surrender. So this is a kind of embodied gesture which says, like, God, you're in charge. But whilst he's lying on the floor, like saying God's in charge, he's having a little chuckle to himself. So he's having a little bit of a laugh. And the question is, like, why is he laughing? Like, what's funny? There's nothing funny about this story at all. But for Abraham, there is something really funny about this story. And I think what's interesting is the way the New Living Translation translates it, is he says, like, sometimes we laugh when we don't kind of quite believe. Like, you know how humour is a kind of weird thing? Like, humour can be really dark sometimes, can't it? You know, like when you sometimes laugh because you just, if you don't laugh, you cry. Like, I think that's a bit of what's going on here. Like, if Abraham doesn't laugh, he's probably going to cry, because this has been 2 decades in the waiting. And he falls down on his face in worship and surrender, and he just starts laughing to himself. Now, some theologians contrast this. If you look at the NIV, so if you've got the New International Version, it doesn't have this little addition, which is about laughter because of the way that he laughed to himself in disbelief, is the way that the New Living Translation translates it. New Living always goes like verse by verse, so rather than a kind of literal rendition of every single word, it's trying to capture the meaning of the entire sentence and then render that. And those who put the New Living Translation together say, I think when he's laughing because he'll cry otherwise. He's laughing because he can't quite believe this is true. NIV says he just laughs and doesn't tell us anything about what kind of laughter it is. You know, laughter can mean all sorts of things, can't it? But I think here laughter means someone who is like both a worshipper, but a worshipper with doubts or disbelief. Like, I think that's often the gap. A gap is often a place where we have a whole lot of mixed emotions going on in us. Like, part of us is like, I'm in this, I'm surrendered, I'm down on my face, I'm a worshipper. Another part of us is like, I'm laughing because if I don't laugh, I'd cry. Or I'm laughing because I've got a little bit of disbelief. And it's not just Abraham who's laughing. Next slide. His wife is also laughing. A little bit later, about a year later or so, there's a few visitors come. They say, you're going to have a baby in a year's time, and she just laughs to herself. She laughs because she's a woman who knows what's happened to her body. The long past the age of having children in the original is that she knows that she's gone through the menopause, like literally. Like, she knows that something has happened to her body that means that dream is gone. Like, she ain't having any more kids. Like, she knows her body, and she knows that something has happened. She also knows the body of the bloke who she sleeps with, and she's like, he's also not up to much, to be honest. Like, the two of us are kind of, we're out of this having babies game. I can't see this happening, and she just laughs because she can't even imagine this could happen. Next slide, there's a lovely little bit of comedy, I think, where God says, like, why did Sarah laugh? You know, which is a kind of question, which is a stupid question to ask in some ways, isn't it? Abraham's like, I know why she laughed. Like, I'd be laughing myself about this whole nonsense that you told us. Sarah's like, I didn't laugh. God says, like, I'm sure you laughed. I heard you laugh. It's like a really lovely little bit of comedy. There's this kind of moment of laughter that takes place in the story. Abraham is laughing and Sarah's laughing because they can't believe, they can't like even want to believe. Like, it's too painful to believe that this could possibly happen because everything is saying this ain't happening anymore to a couple of old people. One's a menopausal woman, one's an old bloke who's not up to much anymore. And you're like, this is over. And when things are over in the waiting, like, sometimes it's just easier to laugh because it's the best emotion to have. Next slide. I mean, there's an extraordinary end to this story, isn't there? A year later, she's pregnant. She gets pregnant. She has a kid. She names the kid Isaac, which means laughter. She's like, now I'm laughing, and everyone else is laughing as well. They're all like, oh my gosh, like, look at that old biddy. Is that the parent or is that the grandmother? You know, like, everyone's laughing. But it's a different kind of laughter, isn't it, at this time? Next slide. And I think there's something about living between promise and fulfillment that is so very difficult. Like, it's really difficult to live in gaps. Because living in the gap, I think, means that we're out of control, and I think our natural tendency is to try and grab control back. Living in the gap means, like, we feel stuff, like we feel disappointment, like we feel a bit let down, like we feel like it ain't happening. We lose hope that it will ever happen. And sometimes we just laugh. Not a kind of happy laugh, but that more sort of poignant sort of laugh, which is like maybe I was a fool to believe this in the first place. You know, and I think what's really interesting about Abraham is, you know, I think the translators have a problem with Abraham, in a sense because of the passage we'll look at in a moment, but they have a problem with the fact that you can laugh while you're worshipping. Like, you can worship but have a sense of disbelief. Like, I think you can actually laugh while you're worshipping. I think you can worship and be in surrender, but I think you can also be laughing because you've got a sense of disbelief. Doubt is never the opposite of faith. I think doubt is an essential part of faith in many ways. Like, laughter is maybe a part of worship. Not always the kind of happy laughter, but sometimes the laughter which is like, actually, can I really believe this? Like, this almost sounds too good to be true. And that's, I think, what Abraham's doing. And I think that's what Sarah's doing, because that's the nature of living in the gap. It's like there's a lot of stuff going on in the gap. They're quite complex emotions, and sometimes they're a kind of weird mixture of emotions. And I guess the question is, like, how do we live well in the gap? Like, what do we do to live well in the gap? Phil, next slide. This is Romans. So you skate forward all the way to the New Testament, to the book of Romans, and there you get a sense of what Abraham does in the gap. And I think what the translators of Genesis have a problem with this, is they think that if Abraham believes and trusts and has faith, it means that he never laughs out of disbelief. I think Abraham probably does laugh out of disbelief, but what he's doing in that gap is he's filling that gap with faith and belief and trust. Like he's filling the gap with something which is like a kind of sense, a sense of hope, like that hope fills the gap. There's a kind of sense of like God's goodness that fills the gap. There's a sense of kind of hanging on to something, like hanging on to that promise that fills the gap. And that's all the stuff that he fills this gap with. And what's amazing, I think, about this story, next slide, Phil, is that this sense of gap is something that speaks directly to this moment as our kids are waiting like 24 days till Christmas comes. And we're thinking like, oh my gosh, it's coming too quickly. Next slide. This is Matthew again. Like, it's so interesting, isn't it, that Matthew says that this story of waiting is the story that leads to the coming of the Messiah. Like, there's this moment of 24 years of waiting for Abraham and Sarah. Waiting against all waiting, trying to grab control, laughing out of disbelief, hanging on to faith and hope and belief. Here comes a child who's born, and that child, if you wait long enough, leads to another child, and that other child is the one who is the Prince of Peace. Like this, the Bible is a story full of waiting, and often I wish it was a story about getting everything now, straight away. But it ain't that story. It ain't that story in Genesis, and it ain't that story in Matthew. It takes centuries for Malachi's vision that actually there might be peace coming to finally arrive in the birth of a child in Bethlehem. And that birth of a child in Bethlehem has behind him a story of barren people who wait a long time to get pregnant. And the beginning of, it's one of those stories where it feels like it could be snuffed out right at the beginning. Like you don't get child 1, let alone child 42 down here at the bottom. But child 1, after 24 years, finally arrives. And the laughter of disbelief is turned into a different kind of laughter. A laughter that ultimately, transforms the entire world. But at a kind of micro and meta level, I think we're always living in this place of waiting. Like, as human beings, we're always waiting for stuff. Like, we kind of find ourselves in a gap of waiting. And I think more broadly, we're always caught in this sense of waiting between the moment when Jesus arrives and the moment when Jesus returns. The kind of already of the kingdom of God and the not yet of the kingdom of God. Like, waiting is our game, like it or not. I think most of the time we don't like it. But maybe we can think about, like, what do I do when I feel out of control? Like, is it possible sometimes to fall flat on my face and also laugh with disbelief at the same time? Like, how do I bring all of my complex emotions before God in worship? Like, the hope that I have and the lack of hope I have, the faith that I have and the disbelief that I have, how do I all bring all that stuff to worship? How do I kind of hang on to hope and belief and trust? And one thing I was really struck by with this is that we never wait alone. Like, I think that's the thing about Christian community, is that I'm never called to wait alone. I'm always called to wait with others. And I think there's a huge difference between waiting alone and waiting with others. Like, I think waiting with others is a lot easier. Like, it's a heck of a lot easier. Because at those moments when I'm on my face in surrender and I'm laughing with disbelief, maybe I need someone else to come alongside me who's just got a little bit of hope and a little bit of faith and a little bit of belief to kind of lift me up a little bit and just to kind of help me along that way. Like, the waiting game is never a game that we have to do on our own. I think it's always a game that we can pursue and follow together. So we start Advent today. We start 24 long or short days of waiting. Think about 7 centuries of waiting. Think about 24 years of waiting for a baby. And think about the fact that, frustratingly, God doesn't seem to just do everything now, straight away, immediately. But He invites us to wait. And maybe there's something valuable in the waiting. Maybe I learn something about myself. Maybe I kind of grow in a certain way. Maybe I mature a little bit in waiting. Maybe I become a bit more dependent upon other people. maybe I become a bit more dependent on God. Like maybe there's something in that waiting that actually is a kind of refining moment. That, at least, is my positive take on waiting for those kids that have got 24 days to go. It'll be better when they get there than it would be if it arrived tomorrow. Should we stand? Let's just pray. Yeah. What we're going to do is we're going to just take a moment to wait. To invite the Holy Spirit to come. The Psalms are full of the invitation to wait on God. And it sounds great, but it's sometimes quite hard. And in some ways this morning, what I'd invite you to do is like, what's the thing, where are you finding yourself in that gap between promise and fulfillment at the moment? Like, what's the thing that you're waiting for? Like, you're waiting for God to come through on it. And we're going to break in a minute because we've come to the end of time. But I think what I'd really encourage you to do is think, actually, if that's something that you feel like, actually, I know there's something in my life at the moment where I really am waiting. What I'd encourage you to do is I'd encourage you to find one other person or two people and say, like, I want you to wait with me. Like, I need you to wait with me on this. Like, I don't want to just wait on my own. Like, I actually want some people to wait with me. Like, this is where I am. This is the waiting that it feels like I've got in my life at the moment. And I need you just to stand by me. And so just to invite a couple of people to say, like, okay, I want you to stand by me and just pray for hope. Because my hope's slipping away a little bit. Or for belief. Because my belief is turning into doubt. Or for faith. Because my faith doesn't feel so strong at the moment. So that's what we're going to do in a moment. So I'm just going to pray. And then I'd really invite you to, if you feel like, yeah, this is the thing that I need at the moment. Maybe just kind of stay where you are standing. And then it'd be great for a couple of people just to come and join you and to stand with you and just to kind of wait with you. Because I think that's the joy of Christian community, is like we never wait alone. The gap's hard, but we never have to wait alone. We've always got people who can wait with us. And Father, we just thank you for that. Thank you that you don't just set us on a road alone, but you set us on a road with others alongside us, who, when we lose hope, can bring hope and speak hope into our lives. And when we feel like disbelief is our dominant mode, can speak belief and trust. And when we feel like our faith is failing, can speak your faith. And that's the thing that we really asked you to do this morning. Maybe as we meet in community groups this week as well, just that there'd be a sense of others who wait with us to help us to wait well. Amen. So if it resonates, just maybe stay where you are. Keep standing. Have a look around. Everyone else, go and find someone. Just stand with them. Maybe you don't need to ask them what they're waiting for. Maybe it's just a sense of saying, like, I'm standing here with you. Because I want you to know today that, like, actually, you've got someone alongside. Someone's got your back. Like, we're waiting with you. There's a few people. It'd be great just to come and to pray, just to speak the words of faith and belief. If you've got kids, it'd be great to get your kids in a minute. It's great to see you. We'll be together at community groups, hopefully in the week, and maybe